Hello and welcome to Municon 2021. I am Nushin Priya with the Washington Department of Ecology, and I will be moderating Stormwater Story Maps, Streamlining Project Outreach by Emelie Crumbaker with AspectConsulting, Brandi Lubliner with the Washington Department of Ecology, and Teizeen Mohamedali, also with the Department of Ecology. This is a pre-recorded presentation. Please type in the questions in the Q&A box, and the presenter will answer your questions after the presentation.
Hello, and thank you for joining my pre-recorded presentation about Stormwater Story Maps, Streamlining Project Outreach. My name is Emelie Crumbaker, and I work as a Senior GIS Analyst / Stormwater Nerd at AspectConsulting. I'm really excited to be co-presenting today with Brandi Lubliner from the Washington State Department of Ecology's SAM program, and Teizeen Mohamedali, who also works for the Washington State Department of Ecology as an environmental engineer. So why story maps? Increasingly, we are being asked by the public and our colleagues and our kids to share more meaningfully about the work and projects we're doing in a web-based format. Sometimes that can mean sharing project data or analysis results within a project team. Sometimes that might mean sharing project highlights with our colleagues, councils, stakeholders, and sometimes it might mean sharing that same information outwardly to the public. More and more people are turning to story maps to accomplish that goal. Story maps are an Esri platform for digital storytelling. If you go to their website, you will see a plethora of information about how to tell stories, examples of great ones, and how to put together your own. And, they're really just one vehicle out there to share a story on the web. There are other great website building programs and web map sharing software programs out there to consider. But the one thing that Esri does that maybe makes it a little easier for jurisdictions is that they build on your ability to do some double dipping. Oftentimes, organizations are already using the Esri suite of software to build web maps and interactive mapping applications. And they do kind of help you get that content into the story map place if it's already available in your organization. Your organization may already be paying for the software, and that also would reduce a barrier for use. And they can be a really efficient and effective way to pull your content together that also lets users interact with spatial information and engage with the work that you and your colleagues are producing or managing. As we all know, you can talk about the same project to your environmental engineering colleague or your 6-year-old son, and the way you tell the story to each of them will be very different, but it would be equally valuable to each of those people. So whatever story you have to tell, as probably those that are actual communications experts could elaborate at length on, it's really the hard part is crafting the content that you want to tell for the audience you want to tell it to. You can relate it to the hard work of coming up with a presentation that people might want to listen to, and the easy work afterwards of just getting your slides pulled together once you know what you think people are going to want to hear about. Those are the main parts of when you start to think about a map-based outreach project. It's really, what's your story? And whether you're trying to present or persuade or inform an audience, creating the content is usually the most time-consuming part of the process. It requires the most in-depth thinking from a technical standpoint, and definitely from either the editing, communications, or marketing lens. Whoever's job it is to come in and review that content for your audience and help you, whether it's to keep things simple and high level, or alternatively to make things concise and technical in order to reach the specific group of people you're targeting. Some of this might be really obvious, but it truly is the nuts and bolts of crafting a good story. When you think about the content, there's also rounds of review and revisions and approvals that add up to the time it takes to put together what is typically a very brief experience for your audience. As we all know too well these days, your audience has less and less of an attention span. Have I lost you yet? So you have to work with that. And knowing that you probably only have a couple minutes to at least hook them, how do you do it? Graphics and interaction. Graphics are a huge part of it. And when we talk about digital story mapping, and story maps tend to kind of elevate themselves again as a way to bring in that interactive mapping content. There doesn't actually have to even be a web map or a map at all in a story map, but people kind of intuitively know that if you can get people to actually start clicking around, you're halfway to getting them to engage. So for example, here's a story map we put together to describe a project that we did for the city of SeaTac in 2018. The project was an LID infeasibility assessment with a series of web maps for the public and planners at the city to use. The web maps helped inform users about LID limitations within the city. And after we completed the project, we put together a story map really as a blog post about what we've been up to and a proof of concept for ourselves as to what that process of developing a story map was really like. So we did rely a lot on graphics, as much as we could really, to help people want to read about the story. Finding good imagery. So, it might not be from your project, it just might be a great example. So we spent time thinking about what parts of the project were really going to be interesting to people. This steep slope here was clearly a very critical area. It might not have been exactly within the boundary of the city of SeaTac, but it gets the viewer pulled into understanding how serious this problem is and why these tools that help planners understand where it's not a good idea to do infiltration, why those things actually matter. And the dots start connecting. And when people are connecting, they're engaged. You can click around to different hazard areas and really start to understand more about the project as a whole. And once people are clicking, the chances are higher that they might do some reading and comprehension. So you kind of have to rely on that as a strategy and know that you're not going to land on the front page of the New York Times with your stormwater story map. But if you can get through to the group of people that you want to, it can be a very rewarding experience. When data is used honestly, it can show and highlight disparity in past choices and existing conditions, and it can be used to track progress over time. So for those reasons, data is often used to push the needle to more equitable decision making. And I think as the public demands more transparency and jurisdictions and municipalities rise to meet those demands, there will be more equitable and transparent decision making happening. And story maps can have a place in presenting how that happens because they bring together data, spatial information, and storytelling. I think they're a vehicle for progress, and I think that can be a very exciting place to be in when we talk about our small world of stormwater and analysis. And it's just another thing to consider when making decisions about whether your project would be a good project for something like a story map. But without any further ado, I'm going to roll into the interviews with Brandi and Teizeen, and they can share their really interesting stories. Can you give me a little background about why the need for the story map came about and who you specifically think your audience was for it?
The SAM monitoring is a cooperative program under the municipal permits, and we contract for monitoring studies to measure the effectiveness of different stormwater actions. And each project produces a lot of deliverables, and it's really the goal of the SAM not only to contract for these things and get this work done, but to communicate those products and where we are on the project to all the people paying in. So that's all those stormwater managers, all those permittees, all those staff that are opting into this cooperative, which is over 90 permittees in the area. They want to be able to see and track where we are, and we produce final reports on each project, and we produce a small 2-pager that's easily to read called a SAM fact sheet. But across projects, we haven't had something to tie a bunch of our bioretention studies together. So we thought a story map could be a way to tie multiple studies, and even studies that we weren't necessarily running. work being done like at the Stormwater Center. So we're trying to tie together multiple studies all at once. Part of the administration of SAM is to figure out our target audience, and stormwater permittees and managers and staff are our primary target for our communications. And then like elected officials and things like that help make up stormwater policy regionally. It just seemed like a cool idea for me to coalesce something that has a geographic extent, but then also other layers of information.
What kind of individuals were involved with putting it together, and about how much time did it take?
There are a lot of people involved because I'm not a GIS person and I don't do coding and all that stuff behind it. For SAM in particular, we had retained the Association of Washington Cities because cities and counties are our main permittees. We use them as our communication lead, and they helped us build this story map with I think they subcontracted, but so they built that content and I built the text content. But then to have it live at Ecology on Ecology's GIS framework, there are a lot of people involved. So there's everything from editing to communications to coding to GIS. It really is a lot of people involved. And it also wasn't like a start finish all at once task for me. So it did take a lot of time, several months, maybe even a half year for me to really either get it going to sort of finishing it. At first I thought I could dive into this technical topic of bioretention and go really far. I drafted up 10 pages of text, but I pretty much learned right away that it's going to be really important to have access to a good editor and really condense complicated information or really technical, multidisciplinary information into really more succinct, understandable language. It took a lot of people to be getting this to the point that it finally reached, which I think is a good product. But that was the biggest part. It's like condensing. Okay, go ahead and just scrap all that. Let's focus on this main point.
The hardest part really is coming up with what you want to say, which is the same process for like what we're doing, like a conference presentation.
In hindsight, it is a lot like building a really good presentation, which actually may not have hardly any words on the page.
During this time of COVID, there's people are forced to more and more share this way.
It's a very visual way to share information, and that's kind of fun. It's prettier than the average design document,
I'd love for more municipalities and jurisdictions and what have you to kind of like consider that, moving away more from the PDF.
Yeah. Do you think there's other tools too that can approach, it may not be an ARC product, but like it's more like there's other software.
Story maps is kind of the Esri branded word for it, but there are definitely other programs, other platforms, and different web services that you can use to make similar things, even from a web map all the way to kind of like a website that has the ability to bring in web map content.
Yeah, it seems like there's an explosion of different platforms, because I know the one stretch with this particular story map is it's actually not very geographical. There's only one page that is geographical. Right. And so it's kind of like, well, we should be using this platform for map-like stuff.
We have a lot of different folks in our company that are using story maps really as just a website.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like they don't have any mapping content in it. It's just a very easy way to put together a quick scrolling website and just kind of share and get people excited and kind of thinking creatively about, how they can do outreach for the projects that they're doing in their municipality. Can you give me a little background about why the need for a story map came about and who you specifically think your audience was?
I think we had funding from the National Estuary Program, and we had certain deliverables we had to do, and one of them was kind of develop the story of nitrogen Puget Sound. We didn't want it to be a technical report. The idea wasn't to do new analysis, but just present information that we already knew and synthesize it. The communication piece is what made us moved towards a story map because it wasn't meant as a peer-reviewed technical report. It was meant to consolidate what does ecology do with related to this? Who do we monitor? What do we know? What are other studies? We had originally a web page, an ecology web page that had that information that I worked on. But the web page was pretty restrictive because we had to meet agency rules and requirements on font, and just it wasn't dynamic. You know, our agency has a S3 resources, and I was like, oh, we should turn this static, dull web page into a story map. So that's kind of how it started, was trying to find something that was more interactive with the user, and we wanted it to have different levels of detail. So it would, the homepage would be, you know, more for a lay audience, and then as you go deeper and deeper into the subheadings, and then it could reach a science audience or a researcher who does want that detail. So it was a little hard to meet all those things, but we've had requests over time where people are like, where can I find this information? So we wanted it to be broad and specific at the same time.
Internally at Ecology, like what teams and what peoples were involved? How much time did it take to kind of pull it together? And, you know, who created the content? What were those kind of challenges?
So it was primarily me and Sheila McCarthy who created the content and worked together. Like she would make certain maps. I did a lot of the text writing, and then or if she did, I would review it. I would say the maps were kind of 50-50, and then we created images, design programs that were not, there were static images, not map images, and trying to make it pretty and visually appealing. So we were the two primary authors, I would say. It still had to make it through kind of technical review rounds in the way that like a peer review might happen for one of our reports. So we had, you know, a supervisor review, and then we had different sections where, like if we had a section on marine monitoring, we asked somebody in the marine monitoring unit to review it. And I think we had Word documents with the text before we put them in the map. Different people had to look at different bits. So we tried to get it pretty final in Word documents, just at least the text part, and kind of go through, you know, your traditional review. I think one of the challenges has been, we always thought it would be a living document or a living map where we'd update it every quarter. We have had no time to do that. Kind of the funding for the work was limited, and I'd like to keep updating it. We have a GIS unit, but they were involved in helping us with technical issues, but they're not responsible for the content because it's very technical in content. So you have to have the scientists actually doing the content development. You can't assign it to a GIS analyst. So it's been difficult to keep it updated. And I think it would be more valuable if it was being updated more frequently.
I would imagine that kind of coordinating all those different people and those different parts probably took, you know, quite a few months to actually.
Yeah, and also like Sheila and I both pretty good at multiple things. Like we can both write, we both know the science, we both can make maps, and we both have some graphic design skills, even though we're none of those things by itself. She's like a hydrogeologist and I'm an environmental engineer. And so I think that actually worked really well because we had like a skill set that worked well to create an effective story map. And I think it would have taken more work for somebody else to do that if we hadn't worked with that kind of communication before, even if it wasn't a story map. So we worked well together in those multiple different skills that a story map needs. So we didn't have to pull in a GIS analyst or, you know, but we did have some content experts. I think the hard part was the policy part. We wanted to just be very objective and say this is what we know without making any like conclusions necessarily about what should you be doing about the problem, because there's reports for that. We started in like spring 2017, and then we had like a review a year later by the water quality program, the policy folks. So, and then we kept putting things that we wanted to do in the next update folder, and that hasn't really happened. So it was nice that the problem was kind of defined for us based on what the web page intent was. Like the intent wasn't really changing, but we knew we weren't really reaching the audience we wanted to reach with it. And it just wasn't interesting in the way it was presented. So
right. Would you do another one?
I would if I could stop doing something else. Like when you're not the person in the program whose job it is to create story maps, it means you're just squeezing it in and being like, hey, we're doing this project and a story map would be a great product to add. But, well, when are we going to do it? Like, it's not, I think it has to be part of the scoping, and you have to take into account the time it's going to take and the people who are going to do it. And that's not often part of our scoping, because story maps are still, it's not, there's always like a product at the end, and it's often a report because we have to go through peer review rounds and we have to cite our references and we have to like have all this detail, and we're beholden to stakeholders who might ask for XYZ. So we have to show what we've done. And story map is not always the right tool for that, but I think there's always a story to tell that will reach a different audience in whatever work we do. That's not a priority always. I think it will change maybe as we move more towards different ways of conveying technical information. But I don't think that the emphasis on report writing is going to go away anytime soon. I also don't think it should. It's just hard to prioritize the communication piece when it's not prioritized from the beginning. I'd love to see it be kind of like a central part of or science communication. It doesn't have to be a story map, but just how can we be more creative and how can we create two communication products? One is like your big fat 100-page report, but then how do we put the executive summary or the main results in a map format?
When you said you'd like to see more creative ways of sharing science communication, and you're right, like story map is just one way. And really in a lot of cases, we're using story map as just a website, like
right.
a web page developer.
Yeah, because it has a framework and you don't do the coding and you can
right.
add whatever images you want.
Yeah.
You don't even have to have a map, or even you just have one map.
They've done a good job, Esri, of like making it so that it's all scrolly and clean, and especially the new version of the story map is just like really appealing, and it's just so easy to put together. All the information's already in our internal enterprise. All these things make kind of a build your own project website under lock and key too, where we have enterprise, so we can require that you have password protection. And I think the tides are kind of changing in that slowly the public is kind of demanding a little more transparency on just some of the science work that happens, and maybe just from an interest level too. And so I see tools like this being helpful for, smaller municipalities or other permit holders that in the stormwater world, when they're trying to talk about why we picked this retrofit project in this neighborhood versus this one in this neighborhood.
I think the hard thing is just finding the time and resources, and you can't find it at the end. So you have to say, this is a priority for this project is to create science communication product. And this is the intent of the product, and you have to scope it from the beginning so that you have it actually makes it into the end of the project. So, but I feel like right now, often it's an afterthought. Like I'm working on a project now, I'm like, oh, this would be really good to present as a story map, but nobody has the time to create it.
Time, yeah, that's always the thing. Thank you so much, Teizeen. Those were some really great observations. It was a pleasure to get the opportunity to talk to both of you. Thank you very much. I hope the audience also enjoyed our conversation and this presentation. Contact information is up on the screen, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or continue the conversation. And if anyone has any questions right now, I can answer them or pass them along to Teizeen or Brandi.
All right, that was great. Thank you for that. We have time for a couple questions, so please enter them in the chat and I will pose them to Emelie.
And I just got a direct message about how often are story maps maintained and updated. And I think that can really vary. They can be on a pretty loose schedule where it would just be around technical software updates, but kind of as Teizeen had talked about, if there's things that, you know, technically people are hoping to keep updating over time, it in the end all comes down to people's time to do it. So.
Has there been any feedback from the audiences who utilize the story maps that were discussed?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that we receive feedback. We've done some story maps that are more like project collaboration, where we're using web maps and web GIS to really engage and run meetings and make conclusions and decisions around GIS data. And you know, this is when we take a web map and we share it internally and really talk through all the different data that we're seeing. And in those cases, we found that it's really, really helpful for project teams. And we've gotten really great feedback in that, you know, live feedback from working together. There's one project we're working on right now. It's a stormwater study of water quality at the Kubota Garden, where we're using story map format to share the water quality information internally with our team, and then also to the stakeholder group, which is SDOT, SPU, Parks and Rec, and the Kubota Garden Foundation. And that's been working really well. And eventually we're gonna kind of turn that out to the public and daylight the process and the results. As far as these ones that are more about outreach related story maps, what we do is we measure feedback with some like Google Analytics. So we follow along how people are staying engaged and what they click on. But for the most part, people don't really take a leap to reach out. And what we've been talking more about, it's kind of a like a software dev jargon, but a call to action, which is essentially a way to kind of get your audience to loop back in, whether it's a survey or, you know, learn more or email us to talk about this. And so we're starting to more consistently put those in, but right now we really use Google Analytics to just see where people are going. And, you know, we can tell that it's been shared around, and you can see when you share it on a post or something that more people will pass it to other people. That's basically how we track that.
Great. Yeah, you've touched a couple of the questions that were in the chat. Is there a recommended length for a story map?
Yes. We've found, at least when with these more public facing outreach, under 10 kind of slides is the sweet spot. Anywhere between really 6 and 9 is probably really perfect. But again, it goes back to people's attention spans. And what we like to do is kind of, you can embed in ways people can dig in more, but not forcing them through that being the only path to interact with it. So if you can keep your kind of slides, that main stage and the scrolling narrative to just 6, 7, 8 slides, and then you can embed links and click here more, and people can dig in on their own time. That's what works best.
Yeah. Are there experiences in developing story maps in more than one language that you know of?
I believe that I would have to double check, and I can write back to that person and let them know. I think that the story, one of the ecology ones may have been in 2 languages. We haven't done that yet, but that's definitely a great thing to check into.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emelie. Thank you to Brandi and Teizeen as well for this informative presentation. If you have additional questions, please contact the presenters. Their contact information can be found in the program. Thanks again.